At 6 in the morning, the sound of fists slammed against David Martinez's cabin door. Outside stood men in fake police uniforms, demanding he leave his own land. Behind them, Karen Whitmore, a self-appointed HOA president with forged documents and a grip of intimidation. What began as harassment soon unraveled into something darker, a fabricated HOA, buried family land secrets, and a network stretching across multiple states. But one overlooked boundary line would trigger a chain reaction Karen never saw coming. David Martinez never asked for trouble. After retiring from a long career as a land surveyor, he moved into his modest cabin overlooking Lake Serenity, a quiet patch of land tucked away from the chaos of town. For David, life was simple. Morning coffee on the porch, the occasional fishing trip, and evenings watching the sun melt into the lake. After decades of working with maps, boundaries, and property lines, he finally had the peace he had earned. But peace never lasts long when someone like Karen Whitmore decides she's in charge. Karen was new to the area, but she carried herself like she had been running the neighborhood for years. Sharp suits, expensive jewelry, and a permanent scowl that suggested she was always 2 steps away from yelling at someone. Her first move, declaring herself the head of a so-called homeowners association, an HOA nobody had ever heard of before. She showed up at David's cabin one afternoon with a thick folder stuffed with paperwork. "Mr. Martinez," she began, voice sweet but sharp. "As a resident of Lake Serenity Estates, you're required to comply with HOA rules and fees. This packet explains everything." David frowned. "Lake Serenity Estates? This land isn't part of any subdivision. I should know. I've surveyed every acre within 10 miles of here." Karen's smile tightened. "I assure you, sir, it's all been reorganized under community management orders. You'll find the documents outline your obligations monthly, fees, architectural guidelines, and of course, penalties for non-compliance." He flipped through the papers. Something immediately felt off. The language was loaded with confusing legal jargon, citations to ordinances that didn't exist, and signatures that looked suspiciously copied and pasted. Most damning of all, the supposed county seal was a blurry photocopy. "Looks official, doesn't it?" Karen pressed, watching him carefully. "It looks fake," David shot back. "And I don't pay for fakes." Karen's pleasant facade cracked, voice turned icy. "If you don't comply, we'll be forced to take enforcement action. Trust me, you don't want that kind of trouble." David didn't answer. He had dealt with bluffs before, and this one stank from a mile away. He set the papers down on his porch railing and looked her dead in the eye. "Ma'am, I've spent my whole career proving where lines begin and end, and I can tell you right now you're way out of bounds." Karen left with a glare, but David knew this wasn't over. 2 weeks later, he got his answer. It was 6 in the morning when the pounding started, heavy fists on his cabin door rattling the hinges. David jolted from sleep, grabbed the nearest jacket and stormed toward the noise. "Open up, Sheriff's Department." A voice barked from outside. David froze for a moment, then squinted through the window. 2 men in what looked like police uniforms stood on his porch, but something was wrong. The badges were shiny but generic. The patches didn't match the county design, and their belts carried nothing but plastic-looking gear. "Step outside, Martinez," one of them ordered. "You're in violation of community housing codes. This property is being repossessed under HOA authority." Behind them, leaning against a black SUV, stood Karen Whitmore, arms crossed, lips curled in smug satisfaction. David opened the door just enough to make himself heard. "You two aren't deputies. And Karen, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but it's not going to work." The taller of the fake cops stepped forward. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to remove you by force." David barked a laugh. "Force with what?" "Those dollar store badges. Get off my property before I call the real sheriff." For a moment, the men hesitated. Their act wasn't holding up under David's scrutiny. Finally, Karen snapped. "This is your last warning, Martinez. Pay your dues or face consequences. We'll be back." David slammed the door in their faces, heart pounding. He knew intimidation when he saw it, but this was beyond petty threats. Karen wasn't just bluffing, she was orchestrating something bigger, something organized. Over the next month, the pressure only escalated. Letters stuffed into his mailbox demanding payment. Notices posted on his fence with red stamps, screaming violation. Strangers parked outside his cabin late at night. Headlights aimed directly at his windows. David began documenting everything: photos, notes, recordings. If Karen thought she could wear him down, she had underestimated the wrong man. One afternoon, Deputy Carlos Torres, a local officer David had known for years, stopped by. "Hey Dave, I've been hearing chatter. Something about you refusing HOA compliance." David handed him a stack of Karen's fake notices. Torres skimmed them, his brow furrowing. "This isn't county issued. These seals aren't real." "Tell that to Karen," David said dryly. "She's got fake cops, fake rules, and apparently the nerve to try and evict me from land my family's owned for generations." Torres shook his head. "Sounds like fraud to me. I'll keep an eye on it, but you should watch your back. People like her don't stop until someone makes them." David nodded, already thinking ahead. He had spent decades working with property, deeds, plats, and boundary lines. If Karen wanted to fight over land, then land would be her undoing. Somewhere in his family's old records, he knew there was proof ironclad evidence of ownership that Karen could never touch. The intimidation campaign reached a peak one stormy evening. Rain hammered the tin roof as David prepared dinner when headlights swept across his living room wall. A convoy of SUVs rolled up, and out stepped Karen, umbrella in hand, flanked by 3 of her so-called enforcers. They marched right up to his porch, shouting threats over the storm. "You can't win, Martinez. The HOA owns you now." David didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out an old wooden box from his shelf. Inside, neatly preserved, were survey maps dating back over a century, hand-drawn by his grandfather, notarized and recorded with the county clerk. These weren't just family keepsakes, they were legal weapons. As thunder cracked overhead, David realized something Karen never could. This wasn't just a fight over HOA dues. It was about legacy, history, and the truth written on maps older than Karen's entire scam. And that truth was about to bury her scheme before it ever took root. What Karen didn't realize was that David knew exactly how to fight back, and he had century-old proof. That night, after the storm passed, David set a lantern on his desk and carefully spread out the contents of the wooden box he had kept tucked away for years. Dusty maps, yellowed deeds, and brittle surveyor's notes filled the table. To anyone else, they might look like scraps of old parchment, but to David, they were a family treasure chest, his grandfather's life's work, carried forward by his father, and now preserved by him every line. Every boundary marker on those maps was drawn with meticulous precision. His grandfather, Miguel Martinez, had been one of the first surveyors in the county back in the late 1800s when settlers were still carving out farms and cabins. Miguel was the man they trusted to set the lines straight, and when he wasn't working for others, he was documenting his own land, the acres he bought outright from the railroad in 1887. David traced his finger along one of the maps, following the inked boundary lines that curled around Lake Serenity. His eyes landed on a familiar spot, the small rise where Karen had set up her so-called HOA office. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow laugh. Of course, Karen's entire headquarters sat squarely on land his family had owned for more than a century. Not only did she lack authority, she was technically squatting on Martinez property. The weight of that realization hit him hard. This wasn't just about fake fees or phony cops anymore. This was personal. His grandfather had cleared this land with his own hands, built fences, and hammered survey stakes into the earth. His father had defended it against speculators during the Depression, and now David stood as the last line in that chain. If Karen thought she could rewrite history with a stack of forged documents, she had chosen the wrong target. The next morning, David drove to the county clerk's office. The clerk, an older woman named Janice, who had known David for years, looked up from her paperwork as he walked in carrying the box. "Morning, David. What brings you down here?" "Trouble," David said simply, setting the box on a counter. He pulled out the deed, carefully unfolded and slid it across. "I need to confirm something for me. This land, it's still in the Martinez name, right?" Janice adjusted her glasses and scanned the faded text. Then she clicked through the county database on her computer. "Let's see. Martinez, Section 12, Range 8. Ah, here we go. Yep, this parcel's been in your family name since 1887. Taxes paid. No liens, no transfers. It's clean." David nodded. "And what about this part here?" He pointed to the shaded area on the old map. "That ridge where the so-called HOA has their office." Janice compared the survey lines to the modern plat maps on her screen. Her eyes widened. "Well, I'll be David. Their office isn't just near your land, it's on it clear as day. According to this, they built half their parking lot and office structure on Martinez property." David leaned on the counter, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "That's what I thought." Janice shook her head. "Whoever set that up either didn't check the plats or didn't care. If you wanted, you could have them off there by next week." "Oh, I want to," David said quietly. "Trust me." That evening he called Deputy Torres and laid out the evidence. Torres came by, flipping through the maps with growing disbelief. "Karen's running a fake HOA and squatting her headquarters on your land. This just went from shady to criminal trespass." David nodded. "She's bluffed half the town with legal jargon, but the truth is right here. And when I present this, her whole scheme starts to crumble." Torres leaned back. "Careful, Dave. Cornered people get desperate. If she's already sending fake cops, who knows what her next move will be?" "I know," David said. He folded the maps carefully back into the box. "But this isn't just about me anymore. She's got neighbors scared, paying into her scam, thinking she has authority. The sooner I shine light on this, the sooner she loses her grip." Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. Flyers plastered around town warned residents of dangerous individuals refusing compliance. Letters arrived claiming David owed thousands in delinquent HOA dues. Neighbors whispered, unsure who to believe. But David didn't flinch. He started preparing his case like the surveyor he once was, methodical, precise, and impossible to refute. He took fresh photos of the ridgeline, overlaid them with his grandfather's maps, and matched them to the GPS-verified plat records. from the county, piece by piece. He built an ironclad portfolio of proof. One evening, while walking the ridge with his old transit tripod, David paused at an oak tree near the HOA building. Carved faintly into the bark was an M, the same mark his grandfather used to note survey corners. Time had nearly erased it, but there it was, weathered and stubborn, just like the family who placed it. David set his hand on the tree and whispered, "Don't worry, grandfather, they won't take this land." By the end of the week, David was ready. He had deeds, maps, county verification, and physical evidence. To Karen, they were just old papers and lines on a page, but to anyone who understood the law, they were a sledgehammer one swing away from shattering her fabricated authority. What David didn't know, however, was that Karen wasn't acting alone. She was a piece of a larger puzzle, part of a pattern, stretching far beyond Lake Serenity. And as David prepared to expose her lies, he was about to uncover just how deep the rabbit hole went. But this wasn't just a personal battle. What David uncovered next revealed Karen was only a small piece of something much bigger. After securing proof of his family's claim, David decided to dig deeper into Karen Whitmore herself. He'd learned over the years that bullies rarely acted alone. There were always connections, hidden hands guiding their moves, and the way Karen strutted around town confidant, untouchable, suggested someone was backing her. One evening, David sat at his kitchen table, laptop open, a pot of coffee steaming beside him. He typed Karen Whitmore HOA into the search bar at first. Nothing unusual came up. A LinkedIn profile, some social media posts filled with forced smiles and motivational quotes, a few mentions in local town bulletins. But then he dug further, cross-referencing addresses, looking into property records. That's when the pattern emerged. Karen Whitmore hadn't just appeared in Lake Serenity. She had been in Arizona 5 years earlier running an HOA management, a group in Phoenix that mysteriously dissolved after a lawsuit. Before that, she popped up in Nevada, working with a community standards alliance that folded when residents accused the group of fraud everywhere she went. The story was the same: bogus fees, intimidation, residents threatened into compliance. And just as lawsuits began to mount, Karen disappeared, reappearing in a new state under a fresh business name. David leaned back, staring at the screen. This wasn't some bored suburban tyrant trying to play queen of the neighborhood. This was a professional grifter moving state to state, spinning the same con. But it didn't stop there. Deputy Torres stopped by later that week, a grim look on his face. "I did some checking of my own," he said, pulling up a chair. "You were right to be suspicious. Karen isn't working solo." He laid out a manila folder stuffed with photocopies. Inside were contracts, tax documents, and shell company registrations. At the top of each one appeared the same name, Pinnacle Development Corporation. "They're a massive real estate developer," Torres explained. "On paper, they build planned communities across half the country, but dig beneath the surface, and you'll see a string of shady HOAs set up under their umbrella. Karen, she's one of their local operators." David frowned. "So, she sets up a fake HOA, drives people out, and Pinnacle buys the land for pennies." "Exactly," Torres said. "They target rural areas, minority-owned land, or older residents who don't know the law. By the time anyone fights back, Pinnacle's lawyers swoop in, file endless motions, and wear folks down. Most people just sell and move on." David felt a knot tighten in his chest. This wasn't just about his land anymore. Families across multiple states had been pushed out by the same scam, and Karen was just a foot soldier in a far larger machine. To confirm it, David began mapping Karen's trail. He pinned her old addresses, her dissolved companies, and cross-referenced them with Pinnacle's expansion projects. The connections lit up like a spiderweb. Each time Karen destabilized a neighborhood, Pinnacle moved in shortly after, buying foreclosed properties and flipping them for huge profits. But what unsettled David most was how Karen operated. She wasn't just using fake documents, she had influence. She had deputies who initially looked the other way, lawyers who seemed too quick to file injunctions, and even local officials who nodded along to her claims. "She's got protection," David muttered one night, staring at the web of papers spread across his wall. "No way she's pulling this off alone." His suspicion was confirmed when Torres called him one night. "You're not going to believe this, Dave. Karen tried to recruit me." David blinked. "Recruit you?" "Yeah," Torres said. "She called me into her office a few months ago, offered me a consulting position with the HOA, said I could make some extra cash by helping enforce community rules. I thought it was just her being pushy, so I blew her off. But now I see the bigger picture. She wanted me on the payroll. That way she'd have a deputy in her pocket." David exhaled sharply. "And if you'd said yes, you'd be out there with those fake cops banging on doors." "Exactly," Torres said. "She wanted legitimacy, a badge she could point to, and when I refused, she found her own imposters." That revelation shook David. If Karen was willing to approach a county deputy, who else had she tried to buy? Off judges, clerks, local officials. The deeper he thought about it, the darker it seemed the next day. David decided to test just how deep Karen's connections went. He filed a public records request for any filings related to Karen's HOA. What came back stunned him. Pages of legal-sounding documents, all referencing community standards, fees, and enforcement powers. But here's what caught his eye. Letterhead wasn't Karen's, it was Pinnacle Development Corporation. Karen wasn't freelancing. She was backed, funded, and supplied by a corporation worth hundreds of millions. The HOA scam wasn't just a grift, it was a business model, and David had just peeled back the first layer that night. He sat on his porch staring out at the lake. The crickets chirped, the water rippled softly, and yet he felt the weight of something enormous pressing down on him. For the first time, he understood the scale of what he was up against. This wasn't just a conwoman with fake papers. This was a network, a machine, and Karen was only one gear in the system. But David wasn't the kind of man to back down. He tapped the box of old maps beside him, then glanced toward Karen's glowing office building on the ridge. "She thinks she's got me cornered," he muttered, "but she doesn't realize I've got something she can't fight: truth and time on my side." Karen thought she was running a small-town hustle, but David had just uncovered a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions. The problem, Karen was starting to realize he knew too much. For weeks, David had been gathering evidence, quietly maps, land deeds, documents linking her to Pinnacle. But Karen wasn't blind. She saw the way neighbors whispered around him, how Torres stopped by his cabin more often, how his porch light stayed on late into the night while he pored over paperwork. And if there was one thing Karen hated more than resistance, it was exposure. The first shot in her counterattack came on a Monday morning. David woke up to find the gravel road leading to his property blocked by two black SUVs. Out stepped men in matching security uniforms, complete with badges that looked official enough to fool most people. They carried radios, utility belts, and the smug confidence of people who believed they had authority. "This road is private," one of them barked when David approached. "HOA enforcement only." David stared at him, jaw tight. "This is my land. My family's deed predates your HOA by over a century. Move the cars." The man smirked. "You've been warned before. Non-compliance carries fines and further action." David snapped a photo with his phone. "Great, I'll make sure the sheriff and the FBI see this." For a moment, the guard's smirk faltered, but he held his ground. It was clear Karen had brought in her own private militia, hoping intimidation would finish the job the fake cops couldn't. That evening, Karen made her move in person. She arrived at David's cabin with a small crowd in tow, several residents, a sharp-dressed lawyer, and even a local news crew she had tipped off. Cameras rolled as she marched up his porch steps, HOA binder in hand. "Mr. Martinez," she announced loudly, "you are in violation of multiple community standards, including refusal to pay dues, obstructing security, and hostile behavior toward board members. We are here to serve you notice of eviction." The residents murmured, unsure but clearly swayed by the presence of cameras. The lawyer adjusted his tie, flipping through papers. Karen smiled triumphantly, playing the role of the righteous enforcer. David didn't flinch. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a rolled-up map. Carefully, he unscrolled it across a table on the porch, holding it down with rocks so everyone could see. "This," he said firmly, "is a certified survey map from the county office, dated, signed, and notarized. And right here," he pointed to the bold black line marking his property boundary. "You'll notice something interesting. Your so-called HOA headquarters. It sits squarely on Martinez-owned land." The crowd leaned in. Karen's smile froze. The lawyer's brow furrowed. "Been trespassing on my family's property since the day you built your office," David continued, "which means every notice, every fee, every so-called violation you've issued is invalid. And if you don't vacate immediately, I'll have no choice but to pursue charges for fraud and unlawful occupancy." The silence was electric. Residents glanced at each other nervously. Even the lawyer looked rattled. Karen tried to recover. That map could be fabricated. She sputtered, "This man is dangerous. He's trying to undermine the integrity of this community." But her voice shook, and the cameras caught every second of it. Later that week, Karen doubled down. If she couldn't win in person, she'd bury David in paperwork. Suddenly, he was hit with a barrage of legal filings, injunctions, restraining orders, cease and desist notices. Each one accused him of new offenses: harassment, trespassing, even extremist activity. She was throwing everything at him, hoping something would stick. David spent long hours at his kitchen table, sorting through the mountain of paper. Most of it was nonsense legal jargon cobbled together to intimidate, with no real teeth. But the sheer volume was exhausting. It was Karen's oldest trick: wear people down until they broke. Only David wasn't most people. The turning point came when Torres showed up again, papers in hand. "Dave, you need to see this," he said, laying down a document. It was a new filing Karen had made that morning, demanding the county court recognize her HOA's authority over Lake Serenity. At the bottom, in bold print, was a signature, not Karen's but a representative of Pinnacle Development Corporation. David's stomach dropped. So now Pinnacle's stepping out of the shadows. Torres nodded grimly. "They're nervous. If your evidence is right, and that office sits on your family's land, This could unravel their entire operation. They can't let that happen, so they're escalating. Karen, meanwhile, grew frantic. Residents began to question her. The lawyer who had stood beside her on David's porch quietly withdrew his support, refusing to be part of her spectacle any longer. Even her so-called security guards grew restless when Torres started asking questions about their licensing. But instead of backing down, Karen lashed out harder. She filed police reports accusing David of threatening behavior. She spread rumors in town, claiming he was unstable, dangerous, even violent. Flyers appeared on telephone poles with David's photo stamped with the words domestic terrorist. Report immediately. It was smear tactics at their ugliest, and for a moment, it seemed to work. A few neighbors stopped speaking to him. Shopkeepers gave him wary looks. Even the mailman hesitated before walking up his driveway. But what Karen didn't realize was that her desperation was being carefully documented. Every flyer, every false report, every bogus injunction was all evidence. And David, along with Torres, was quietly building a case that would soon bring the weight of the federal government down on her. On a stormy night, as rain pounded the tin roof of his cabin, David sat at his desk and looked at the piles of evidence stacked neatly in folders. He felt the fatigue pressing in, but he also felt a strange calm. She thinks she's breaking me, he whispered, but all she's doing is tightening the noose around her own neck. He picked up the latest flyer Karen had spread around town, holding it between his fingers. A fake FBI seal stamped across the top, accusing him of terrorism. David chuckled bitterly. This is it, Karen. The one mistake you can't take back. Her desperation would be the very thing that brought everything crashing down. Karen had crossed a line. Faking HOA documents was one thing, but forging federal seals and spreading flyers labeling a decorated veteran as a domestic terrorist, that was no longer a neighborhood dispute, it was a federal crime. Deputy Torres wasted no time. He collected every flyer, every fake report, every bogus legal filing, and carefully logged them into evidence. He knew exactly who to call. Within a week, 2 black SUVs rolled into Lake Serenity. The FBI was here. David watched from his porch as agents in suits met with Torres outside the sheriff's office. He didn't feel vindicated yet, just cautious. He'd spent months dealing with false authority figures, and trust didn't come easily anymore. But when Agent Rebecca Hayes approached him with a firm handshake and a folder in hand, he felt a shift. Mr. Martinez, she said, we've been tracking Pinnacle development for years. What you've uncovered here could be the key to taking them down. David leaned back in his chair. So you know this isn't just about one crooked HOA president. Hayes nodded. Karen Whitmore is small fry. Pinnacle has been running these fraudulent HOA schemes across 3 states. Families harassed, property stolen, even county officials bribed to look the other way. But until now, we've never had clear land records linking them directly to a property they didn't own. David tapped the rolled survey map beside him. You do now. The FBI set up quietly in town, interviewing residents who had been threatened or extorted by Karen. To David's surprise, people began to open up. The family who had been fined for planting a garden. The widow who had been threatened with eviction over improper lawn decorations. Even Karen's so-called allies started confessing, afraid of being caught in the net themselves. One by one, the facade of her authority crumbled. Torres confided to David one evening, "You lit the fuse, brother. She thought she could bully you into silence, but now she's dragged in the one group she never wanted watching." David smirked. About time. But the FBI wasn't stopping at Karen. They were building a RICO case, something usually reserved for organized crime. Pinnacle's fake HOAs were just the tip of the iceberg. Hidden shell companies, offshore accounts, and layers of straw owners all pointed back to a small circle of executives pulling the strings. Agent Hayes asked David to go one step further. "We need someone on the inside. Someone Karen still thinks she can manipulate. Would you be willing to wear a wire?" David raised an eyebrow. "You want me to bait her?" Hayes met his gaze. "She trusts you're scared. That's the weakness we can use." It didn't take long. A few days later, Karen called David, her voice dripping with false authority. "David, we don't need to keep this war going," she said sweetly. "If you agree to drop this nonsense and pay your back dues, I can make all this trouble disappear." David kept his tone even. "What about your office sitting on my family's land?" A pause. Then Karen snapped. "That's a technicality. Pinnacle can fix that. You'd be surprised what a generous settlement might look like if you cooperate." Click. Every word captured on tape. Meanwhile, Torres dug deeper into Karen's security team. Their licenses were fake, their badges counterfeit, their contracts signed through Pinnacle subsidiaries. One even had an outstanding warrant in Nevada for extortion. It was a house of cards waiting to collapse. And collapse it did. One Friday morning, unmarked vans and SUVs swarmed Lake Serenity. Residents peered through blinds as agents and windbreakers stormed Karen's HOA office, carrying out boxes of files and hard drives. Karen herself was led out in handcuffs, screaming about conspiracies, insisting David had forged everything. Cameras caught her wild-eyed rants as agents pushed her into the back of a van. For many residents, it was the first time they realized the HOA president who had lorded over them wasn't just a bully. She was part of a national scam, but the real fireworks came days later when the FBI unsealed indictments. Karen was just the tip. Pinnacle's CEO, 3 regional managers, and even a county assessor in Nevada were charged with fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. The network that had preyed on families for years was finally being dragged into the light. News outlets picked it up nationwide. Fake HOA scam busted in multi-state operation. For the first time, the story was bigger than Karen. David sat in his cabin, watching the news scroll across the TV. It felt surreal a few months ago. He'd just been a man wanting peace on his land. Now his quiet stand had helped expose a criminal empire. Yet Karen wasn't done making noise. From her jail cell, she filed rambling letters claiming she was the victim of a government plot, that David was an extremist, that Pinnacle was innocent. None of it mattered anymore. The weight of evidence was too heavy. One evening, Agent Hayes stopped by David's cabin again. She laid down a thick folder. "Your testimony will be critical, but I want you to see something." Inside were financial records, millions of dollars siphoned from families across the Southwest, names of victims, fake liens placed on homes, properties flipped for massive profit once families were forced out. David's hands tightened on the folder. "All this over greed," Hayes nodded, "and you helped break it open. Without that survey map, without your persistence, they'd still be running unchecked." That night, David stood on his porch, listening to the quiet lap of Lake Serenity against the shore. For the first time in months, the air felt still, unburdened. But deep down, he knew the fight wasn't truly over. Pinnacle was wounded, but not dead. And men with that much money and power rarely gave up quietly. Still, for now, justice had caught up with Karen Whitmore. Karen thought she could outwit everyone, even in handcuffs, even facing federal charges. She still believed she could talk her way out, but the walls were closing in fast. From her cell, she tried everything: letters to the judge, calls to old contacts, even a handwritten press release claiming she was the victim of a government conspiracy. She accused David of being a militia leader, accused Torres of falsifying evidence, accused the FBI of framing her. None of it stuck, because this time, the evidence wasn't just hearsay. It was overwhelming. The FBI traced wire transfers directly from Pinnacle's shell companies into Karen's accounts. They had recordings of her threatening residents, her deals with phony security contractors, and even her taped conversation with David, where she offered him a payoff to stay quiet. Her once loyal followers began flipping one by one. The lawyer who had stood beside her admitted she'd pressured him into signing bogus filings. A security guard confessed he'd been paid in cash to intimidate families. Even Karen's closest board members turned witness in exchange for lighter sentences. By the time her trial date came, Karen Whitmore wasn't a feared HOA president anymore. She was just another cog in a broken machine discarded by the very empire she thought protected her. David didn't attend every day of the trial, but when he did, he made sure to sit in the front row. Karen avoided his gaze at first, but on the day the FBI played the recording of her call where she tried to bribe him, her eyes finally met his. For the first time, David didn't see arrogance or menace. He saw fear. The jury took less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts: conspiracy, fraud, impersonating law enforcement, and racketeering. The judge sentenced her to 22 years in federal prison. When the gavel fell, Karen snapped. She screamed at the courtroom, at the FBI agents, at David himself. "You think you've won? Pinnacle will never go away. You don't know who you're dealing with." The bailiffs had to drag her out as her voice echoed off the walls. But she was right about one thing: Pinnacle wasn't finished. While Karen rotted in prison, the federal investigation widened. The CEO and senior executives faced trial next. Multiple counties in Nevada and Arizona purged officials who had taken bribes. Civil suits were filed by hundreds of families who had been wronged. For the first time, the full scale of Pinnacle's operation became public. They had siphoned nearly $500 million through fake HOAs, manufactured liens, and land grabs. It was one of the largest organized property scams in U.S. history. And it all started unraveling because one man refused to back down. David didn't think of himself as a hero. When reporters came to Lake Serenity asking for interviews, he mostly waved them off. He wasn't interested in the spotlight. But privately, he felt the weight of it. His grandfather's land survey, rolled up in a dusty tube for over a century, had turned out to be the weapon that toppled an empire. One evening, Torres sat with him on the porch sipping coffee as the sun went down. He realized, "Dave, this case is going to be studied for years. Law schools, FBI training, even homeowner rights groups. You put a dent in a machine that's been grinding people up for decades." David shrugged. "I just wanted to be left alone." Torres grinned. "And look where that got you. Half the country owes you thanks." Still, David knew the fight wasn't completely over. Pinnacle might be wounded, but corporations that size rarely vanish. There would be appeals, settlements, maybe even new scams under a different name, but something had shifted. People weren't as willing to stay silent. Any more families stood up. Neighbors questioned authority. Even small-town sheriffs started taking a harder look at HOAs that suddenly popped up with suspicious rules. David had become a quiet symbol of resistance, a man who stood his ground when it mattered most. Months later, when the dust had finally settled, David hiked out to the old stone boundary marker his grandfather had placed generations ago. He ran his hand along the weathered surface, carved with initials almost worn smooth by time. That marker had outlasted men like Karen Whitmore. It would outlast Pinnacle as the lake breeze rustled the trees. David allowed himself a rare smile. His family's land was safe. For now, Karen's story ended in a prison cell, but her downfall revealed something much larger. This wasn't just about one woman with forged papers, it was about a system that allowed greed to masquerade as authority. A system that preyed on the vulnerable, until one overlooked boundary line brought it all crashing down. Karen tried to steal one man's land. Instead, she exposed a billion-dollar empire built on lies, and it leaves us with a question. What would you do if the people knocking on your door weren't who they claimed to be?